Well, you related to people who lost their children. I mean, who committed suicide and were on this drug. So for them, it must have been a very, very emotional thing. And for them, they wish their child had not taken that drug, obviously, and had some pimples rather than being dead. And it was their decision in supporting you that even if this happens rarely for the person that it happens to, the balance of the benefit versus the harm is pretty dramatic. Are these people getting on a bandwagon and providing you with continuing support for what you're doing?
Well, if you have a son or daughter who's in the prime of life, a teenager, suddenly disappear, lose their life because of a suicide related to taking a prescription medication, it's a devastating event, and it's something that you'll never recover from. To have a child die, I mean, I can't even imagine it. It's you know, that would be one of my worst fears, is to have a child die. And then to go up against this multi-billion-dollar marketing machine that's whose primary mission is denial, can be extremely frustrating. Because if we could all put our heads together and try and figure out how can we make the situation better, then people would feel better about that. But that's not what we have in this particular case. And there's other examples. There's asthma medications called Singulair, which has made some people depressed and have other psychiatric reactions. And there's like medications for the treatment of malaria that cause psychiatric symptoms in about half of patients. And the list goes on. And there's multiple examples of medications where the true risk to benefit ratio has been distorted in favor of a view that is most amenable to a pharmaceutical company. And there's even been a congressman, Bart Stupak's son, died taking Accutane. He was a young 16-year-old. He was on the football team in the prime of life, and the suicide just came out of the blue while he was taking Accutane. And even with the congressman's son, who called for congressional hearings and for investigations by the FDA, you know, this is back in 2000, and there was some calls for to do more research on the part of the drug company that made the drug. And 2 years later, it sort of mysteriously dropped, where the FDA decided that the studies were no longer needed, and it wasn't really clear why that's the case, but the company ultimately never did do any of the kind of background studies that were required. Now, a company is required to do studies of a drug before it gets approved, and they study maybe a few thousand people, and then once it's approved, they're no longer required to do any kind of research to assess the safety of the drug. So if you have something like this where an event could happen maybe 1 out of 100 people, it may not be enough to pick it up when they do the initial studies, but they should be required to go back and do studies after the drug has come out on the market to make sure that the drug is safe. But they typically don't do those kinds of studies. In fact, many of the studies of like Vioxx and some of these other pain medications like Celebrex were done not to assess the safety of the medication. They were done to try and expand the market. So they're called seed trials, where either they try and prove something that would help their market, like in the case of Vioxx, they were trying to prove that it caused less bleeding in the stomach than other drugs for the treatment of pain. And then by accident, they found out that it caused more heart attacks. And then when some doctors tried to go and publish some of this data, the company actually tried to stop them and tried to go to the journals and try to get the journal not to publish the results. They've done things to try and discredit doctors. You know, they've tried to discredit me by having people with their proxies call me a liar. And they've accused doctors who are pointing out the risks of their medications, like Dr. Eric Topol, who's at the Cleveland Clinic. They accused him in kind of an underhanded way of working for a hedge fund that they claimed was betting against them. And they'll do dirty tricks like that to try and get rid of their critics. They even make up hit lists of doctors where they say, these are all our enemies, and we must seek them out and destroy them where they are. That's an actual quote that came in from a transcript of a court trial related to a hit list that was made up related to doctors who are pointing out the risks of the pain medication Vioxx. Another thing that they'll do is they'll create fake journals. So there's a journal of Australasian bone health or something like that, where they'll hire doctors who are academics to pretend like they're on the editorial board. They'll get these articles that are ghostwritten by their in-house staff. They'll pay all these people to put out this fake journal. It looks like a real journal, but it's not. It's just advertising. And everyone was outraged when they found one of these journals, but then it turned out that there were 8. So there's a Journal of Reproductive Health. There's one for cardiology. There was one for gastrointestinal disease, and they're all fake. And they were paying off Elsevier, who was the company that published them, to create these fake journals. And Elsevier's only excuse, and the doctors who are on the supposedly writing on the editorial boards of these journals, their only excuse was, well, things were different 10 years ago. It wasn't that, maybe that was the wrong thing to do. It's just, well, it was a different climate. And a lot of medical doctors who are in academic leaders, they feel entitled to be able to have a drug company write an article, put their name on it so they get the credit, and then they get a check for allowing their name to be put on this article. They get these CVs that have hundreds of articles, but nobody knows how many they actually wrote and which are ghostwritten, as they say. And so the whole thing is just completely screwy, and it's gotten so out of control that it's absurd. It's a point of absurdity.
Well, the way I see it, you sort of have a company like BP. You've heard of them.
Yeah.
And there's this oil leak. I don't know whether you've heard about it.
Yeah.
And it's causing some problems, and people are distressed, and there's a tremendous amount of outrage throughout the country and throughout the world, and all sorts of congressional investigations and legal actions and so forth against BP for doing something that potentially was not the right thing to do and not having the proper safeguards, and maybe this obviously resulting in a catastrophe which people see on TV and see reported every day. Now, if you have a child who dies, or you have a family member who dies from taking a drug, and it might be 1 out of 100, or 1 out of 1,000, or 1 out of 5,000, then people sort of see that person, they might hear the story, it might not be heard at all, and there's not a herd mentality of outrage. The herd mentality of outrage comes when you see waters polluted, but they don't come when it's a sporadic type of thing, even though it affects a lot of people. So it seems to me as though you can anthropologically understand why there's not the same outrage over a certain improper behavior from a pharmaceutical company versus an oil company. I'm wondering from this standpoint whether there's any way to get the population overall to be more compassionate about things that happen to other people but don't necessarily happen to them. As a psychiatrist, do you have any suggestions or hopes in that area?